A lot of people in One Piece have been absolutely obliterated by Monkey D. Luffy in a fight. And today, we're here to talk about 11 victims of Luffy who just stood no chance whatsoever. This list is in no real particular order. I kind of just threw them in here willy-nilly, so, if a character ranked at number 1 versus number 11, it doesn't mean much. Granted, the last one, number 11, is my personal favorite, so maybe there is a little bit of bias here. Anyways, to get this started, the first victim on this list would be Alvida from episode 1. So when we first met Alvida, not only did she tout herself as one of the strongest captains out there, but she also said she was one of the most beautiful pirate captains as well. And we knew the second part was cap, but the first part was also nowhere near the truth. So Luffy showed up, of course, to help Kobe escape from his situation, and that is when he ran into the infamous pirate Alvida. She ends up hitting Luffy dead in the head with her Kaido-like club, and not only does Luffy tank this blow, but he uses a singular attack to send her flying away. Which is pretty embarrassing after she hyped herself up so much. But yeah, she is the first victim of the story. It's either Alvida or the Lord of the Coast. It really depends on which version you read. If you watch the anime, then it's Alvida. If you read the manga, then the Lord of the Coast took the very first KO. But yeah, either way, Alvida was an absolute stomp in my opinion. And the next one, we are going to post-time skip now, and we are hitting up Vanderdecken, because this one might be one of the foulest defeats I've seen in a minute. But Vanderdecken was one of the main villains of Fishman Island. But don't let the fact that he's one of the main antagonists of Fishman Island cloud your judgment, because the guy was absolutely weak. And it's kind of funny because I don't know how many people were reading Fishman Island at the time weekly, but leading up to the Vanderdecken versus Luffy fight, a lot of people actually thought that Vanderdecken was quite powerful, myself included. There was a lot of weird hype around Vanderdecken. I say weird, but it was actually somewhat justified, right? We had Vanderdecken. He was the most wanted man on Fishman Island. He's been terrorizing Shirahoshi for years and years, and none of the guards or the Neptunian brothers could actually catch this man. He was just that dang elusive. And not to mention, he had the Mark Devil Fruit. So this man had the ability to shoot out homing missiles. A lot of things around this guy were looking pretty dang solid. And not to mention, he also has a pretty decent lineage as well, because the Vanderdecken family probably spans back all the way to the Void Century. So yeah, this guy actually had a decent amount of clout behind him. And then, before we got to this fight, he also teamed up with Hody Jones. Hody Jones! Obviously, it was a joke, but Hody Jones saw this man as an equal. So people were rightfully hyped for this guy. And then Luffy, on the other hand, was not only being hunted by all of Fishman Island because he kidnapped Shirahoshi, but he was also tied up during this fight. Luffy could not use his arms. He only had his legs to go with, and somehow, well, I say somehow, but Luffy demolished Vanderdecken. It was blasphemous. Believe it or not, people were actually theorizing what would happen to Luffy now that the Fishman pirates have captured him. Didn't happen. That theory did not come true. No. Vanderdecken got absolutely beat down. If I recall correctly, Vanderdecken didn't even land a single blow on Luffy or Shirahoshi. So yeah, this guy got stomped literally because Luffy used his feet against him during the entire fight. And not to mention, I think it took only about one blow to actually put this man down in the dirt. So now, coming in at number 3, we have another one-hit KO. But this time around, we are going back to the pre-time skip story, to the infamous Beast King Moji. So Moji, unlike Vanderdecken, actually had zero hype behind him. Granted, I wasn't reading the story weekly at the time. I didn't start until around Jai and Skypiea, but I would like to imagine that nobody actually expected Moji to beat Luffy in this fight. When I talk to my friends about Luffy versus Moji, the first thing they ask is, who is Moji? And after I remind them about who this bozo is, they say, wow, his lion was scarier than he is, and I would agree. That might sound like a diss on Moji, but it actually has some sort of backing to it. So going back to Orange Town, Luffy was trapped in this stone iron-barred prison by Buggy. Luffy couldn't break out of it, and not to mention, not even Zoro at the time could get Luffy out of this prison. So it was pretty impressive when Moji and Richie came by and broke Luffy's cell in a singular blow. And I would argue that releasing Luffy from that cage is one of the worst decisions they have ever made in their life. Because after they release Luffy, they burn down Choo Choo's pet store, Luffy gets enraged, and then he takes Moji down in what I would call an iconic scene. Even though nobody cares about Moji, or even remembers who he is, you gotta admit, this scene right here was actually pretty dang cool. So now the next person who got completely outclassed by Luffy would be the fake Luffy, Tomorrow Black. So I kind of felt weird about including this guy on the list since this wasn't even technically a fight, but it was a case of Luffy just overwhelming his opponent to no ends. I mean, honestly, there's just not too much to say about this matchup. Like, Luffy was walking by, he was going one direction, Tomorrow Black was going that direction, they bumped into each other. Tomorrow Black could have said, hey, no big deal, I'll see you later, good sir. But instead, he tried to fight Luffy, and Luffy, with the stomp of his foot, knocked everyone out. He knocked all the fake Straw Hats out, and it was really embarrassing. Of course, nobody expected Tomorrow Black to actually be strong, but we didn't expect him to be an absolute buffoon either. Actually, never mind. I think everybody expected him to be a complete idiot.
What happened?
Like, come on, the dude was trying to impersonate a pirate who has a bounty of 500 million berries. Like, why would you do that? Actually, wait, no, Luffy had 400 million at the time. He was trying to impersonate a guy who had 400 million berries to his name. Why? Why would you do that? But then again, I guess Luffy and the crew have been missing for 2 years, so it does become a question of when is it okay to commit identity theft? Like, when are you certain that that person is not going to show back up at their house? I feel like Tomorrow Black was actually kind of smart now, right? He waited 2 years to actually do this plan, so maybe he is smarter than I give him credit for. One cool thing about Tomorrow Black, though, this is a little bit of a tangent, but Tomorrow Black's popularity in Japan is actually pretty decent. People love the Tomorrow Black meme. I mean, Tomorrow Black was even a key unit for One Piece Bounty Rush's April Fool's joke. And not to mention, in a One Piece spin-off novel, Tomorrow Black actually sacrifices himself to save Usopp from Impel Down. Keep in mind, though, that the spin-off manga is actually supposed to be a comedy, so I'm not gonna, call that a Tomorrow Black feat, but it's cool that people are still thinking about Tomorrow Black, right? He's not a character that has been forgotten, and I do wonder if we'll ever see Tomorrow Black again. Like, for example, if there's ever another Impel Down escape and we see Bon Clay and we see Doflamingo again, I really hope Tomorrow Black escapes as well, and maybe he'll join Cross Guild. Maybe he'll join the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. I don't think Luffy would let him in. But hey, Tomorrow Black greatness is always a prominent thing in my channel. I'm a big fan of Tomorrow Black. I think he's absolutely hilarious, despite him being an absolute loser as well. So now, on to number 5, we have PX5, the Pacifista robot post-time skip. So Luffy versus the Pacifista was actually a really cool moment. So, coming into Sabaody for the second time, when we saw that Sentomaru brought a bunch of pacifistas with him to stop Luffy, a lot of people were rightfully pretty scared of them, right? I mean, pre-time skip, it took the whole crew to take down a single one. We couldn't beat Sentomaru, we couldn't beat Kizaru, and we couldn't beat Kuma or any of the pacifista, minus the one that we did that took the combined efforts of all the Straw Hats, right? And then the pacifista showed up at Marineford, and they destroyed the Whitebeard allies. There were a couple of captains that did well against the Pacifista, but for the most part, the Pacifista were wiping the floor with 90% of the pirates out there. So, like I said, when we got to Sabaody again, the Pacifista were kind of scary. But Luffy was even scarier, because when the Pacifista spotted him, Luffy not only dodged the laser beams with ease, but he also jumped up, used Gear Second, and destroyed the Pacifista in a single blow. The fact that Luffy could pull off this feat was amazing, not only because it showed Luffy's strength, but it also showed that the 2-year time skip was worth it. Not seeing Zoro, Sanji, or Nami for, I think in the manga, it was like maybe 4 or 5 years. It was worth it. Luffy wasn't just sitting around at Ruskaina, twiddling his thumbs, playing League of Legends duo bot lane with Rayleigh. No. Luffy was actually training up that hockey. He was getting stronger, and him destroying PX5 in a single blow was amazing on all fronts. All right, so the next opponent, coming in at number 6, who got absolutely destroyed by Luffy, would be Bellamy the Hyena. So a lot of people have mixed feelings about Bellamy nowadays because he's actually a pretty good guy. And I don't want to mention his defeat at Dressrosa because that was really just kind of sad. And not to mention, it's a fight that Luffy nor Bellamy even wanted in the first place. So we're just going to mention the first instance of Luffy versus Bellamy that took place over at Jaya. So Bellamy is another character, just like Vanderdecken, that had a decent amount of hype behind him. Yes, that might sound blasphemous nowadays, but you got to keep in mind, One Piece, when we were back at Jaya, was a lot simpler of a time. Right? Nowadays, we know that bounties don't exactly correlate strength, right? Oh, Buggy has 3 billion berries. Oh, God, he's stronger than everybody else below him. No, that's not the case. But at the time, we weren't of that mindset. When we saw a big bounty, boom, 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 you know, like the power levels were blowing through the roof. And Bellamy was one of those characters that I would say suffered from this effect. His bounty didn't exactly correlate with his power. Maybe it did, but at the time, Luffy did still outclass him. And it's not just the bounty of Bellamy that really put him on this pedestal of power, but it was also his previous feats. So when we first got to Jaya, the first thing we saw was Bellamy beating a guy named Roshio the Executioner. Roshio the Executioner, just like Moji the King of Beasts, is another forgotten character of One Piece, but essentially, him and Bellamy were playing a game of, I think, poker. The guy cheated, or I think Bellamy accused him of cheating. Roshio said, hey, I didn't cheat. They had a little back and forth, and what ended up happening was that Bellamy broke a bottle over his head, kicked him out a window, and set his body on fire. And Roshio, while he is a pushover, he had a pretty decent-sized bounty according to the people in the area. So Bellamy was already seen as a mad dog. And then we have the bar scene where Luffy didn't fight back against Bellamy. Of course, there is a lot of nuance to that scene, and, you know, it's a whole thing with, oh, you know, it doesn't matter, Bellamy didn't do anything to us, who cares about Bellamy, we don't have to fight him. So Luffy technically won that fight without throwing a punch, so that was great. But Bellamy still looked like a really strong character at the time. And then we flash forward, and Bellamy beat Shoujo, and Mashira, and Cricket. The guy destroyed all three of them. Which, if you forgot who those guys are, it's the Monkey Brothers and the Mont Blanc Nolan descendant. Bellamy was looking pretty dang fire at the time. And real quick, but just going back to his bounty, because I didn't ever say what number he was at, but Bellamy had a bounty of 55 million berries. Well, yes, we are fresh off the heels of Crocodile, who had a bounty of 80 million. 55 billion is still pretty decent. It's nothing to scoff at when Luffy just barely beat Crocodile. So people did see Bellamy as a mid to high diff battle, but that was until Luffy showed us who was the top dog. So Luffy at the time was actually very enraged by Bellamy, because not only did Bellamy beat up Luffy beforehand, but he also beat up a bunch of Luffy's friends and then ended up mocking all of their dreams. He mocked Luffy's dream, he mocked Cricket's dream, and he also stole all of his hard-earned treasure. Luffy was having none of that BS that night. So Luffy set off on his own. You know, Zoro and Sanji were like, hey, Luffy, do you need help? And Luffy said, nope, I got this. I'll even make it back to the ship on time, which is a pretty crazy statement because, like I said, Bellamy was pretty hyped up. And not to mention, Luffy was going into this fight solo. Bellamy had all of his crew with him, which I know sounds ridiculous, but you gotta remember, like, at the time, Bellamy's crew, they were introduced and they kind of seemed like they were strong, right? We have Eddie the Navigator. We have that one girl whose name I kind of forgot. We have Sarkis, who had the crazy kukri knives. Like, these guys look like madmen. But, of course, Luffy ended up taking down Bellamy in a single blow nonetheless. It was actually such a one-sided stomp that none of Bellamy's crew could believe it. They thought he was pretending, and they didn't even want to fight Luffy afterwards. So yeah, that was another fight that lives rent-free in the memories of so many One Piece fans, and I would say that is probably one of the most iconic moments out of this entire list.
So long, Straw Hat! Hey, quit messing around, Bellamy, and get up. The joke's over. This really isn't funny anymore. Now snap out of it! Your bounty's up to 55 million! You can't lose to some rookie!
Alright, let me take a breather real quick. That was a lot of talking. You guys don't understand what it's like to just yap and yap and yap at a camera without ever taking like a singular breath. So, you know, here's a quick refresher. Also, I usually drink Celsius during these videos, but today I have C4 because my local store stopped selling Celsius. So, F me, I guess. It's actually not bad. A little bit too carbonated for my taste. But flavor-wise, it's pretty decent. I got Watermelon Burst. And yeah, I'm actually kind of vibing with it. I'm a big fan of watermelon and watermelon-flavored things. Funny enough, though, I actually don't eat a lot of fruit at all. I actually can't remember the last time I've had any fruit, now that I think about it. I have sensitive teeth. You know, when I eat ice cream, it really hurts sometimes. Same with watermelon and any other fruit that is normally refrigerated. So whenever I want to enjoy some sort of fruit flavor, I usually get that in the form of drinks. So it's a sad existence, but hey, power to us, right? Power to everybody who has sensitive teeth out there. So now, coming in at number 7, we have our good friend Wapol, who is actually making a pretty decent comeback in the story right now. So Wapol is definitely a fight I would consider a no diff. So Luffy beat Wapol before we even hit Drum Island, because if you remember, Wapol showed up and he was like, hey guys, I want to take your ship, and I also want to eat it. Luffy said no, and then he like slammed him away with the bazooka. Naturally, you'd expect that to be the last time we actually see this guy. But no, you'd be wrong, because he comes back as the main antagonist of Drum Island. And from a narrative standpoint, I think he accomplishes a lot, because we have the whole Dr. Hiddleston flashback, we have the Dalton and Vivi flashback. So I think Wapol delivered on a bunch of fronts, but unfortunately for him, he's just not a strong character. In fact, Wapol is so overwhelmingly weak that in the One Piece Chopper movie, instead of Oda buffing up Wapol to be a decent fighter, Oda had to introduce a brand new character just to make Drum Island a little bit more exciting in a movie format. Wapol is a character who was always meant to be an absolute loser. I will admit, though, that his devil fruit is really cool. He has the ability to combine things that he eats, and while it is cool for himself, it's also cool for other people, because he can combine multiple people and turn them into a single force. And Oda even played around with this idea as well in an SBS, and he drew what the Straw Hats would look like if Wapol used his devil fruit on them. And Oda gave us this character right here named Gagon, which is a very questionable name, mind you. But yes, maybe Wapol, since he is making a reappearance in the story, will finally gag on the Straw Hats. So now, coming in at number 8, we have Dobon. And this might be another character, just like Moji, who you might not be able to recall at first glance. So Dobon, he is the Hippo Man from Udon Prison. So I was kind of hesitant to add this onto the list since it's not technically a fight, but it is a showcase of what it means to be a through and through Luffy victim. So Dobon was one of the prison wardens, and he was kind of overseeing the whole Hyogoro Luffy Kid situation. Luffy and Kid caused a little bit of a ruckus because they ate so much Kibidango. Dobon went over there to stop them and, you know, slap some sense into them, but unfortunately for him, he got dealt with in a matter of seconds. What's kind of sad about this matchup, in my opinion, is that Dobon had a Smile Devil Fruit, right? He was actually somewhat strong. You could argue that Smile Devil Fruit users are not strong compared to the Straw Hats, and I would agree, but in the grand scheme of the world, if you have a Devil Fruit, you're kind of put at a tier above the average citizen. So, you know, Dobon was looking pretty solid on paper. And then not to mention Luffy and Kid, who are both Devil Fruit users, were both handcuffed with Sea Prism Stone. They were weakened at the time. You know, how was Luffy gonna beat Dobon? Well, the answer to that is with absolute ease. So Luffy and Kid smash Dobon in a single hit, and then they walk away whistling with Dobon's corpse being left behind in the dust. And that's pretty much all we have to say about that one. And you know what? Why not throw in an honorable mention and just actually list all of the Udon Prison wardens? Because let me tell you, Luffy has a straight up training arc in Udon Prison where he's just walking around with sea stone cuffs, beating up every single guard in front of him. It is absolutely disrespectful, and this is a weakened Luffy we're talking about here. So now, coming in at number 9, we have Mr. 5. Now that I think about it, I should have put Mr. 5 at number 5, but it's too late for that one. So Mr. 5 is another character who is somewhat forgettable for a lot of people, but he was the first showcase of what Baroque Works is all about. So Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine's Day first appeared at Whiskey Peak, and their whole mission was to assassinate Princess Vivi. Luffy and Zoro, who didn't even really know Vivi at the time, just so happened to be there. So Luffy and Zoro were having their classic banter back and forth. They weren't actually fighting at the time. It was one of the few times Luffy and Zoro actually clash. And Mr. 5 says, hey, who are these bozos? Why are they ignoring us? Why are they fighting? Miss Valentine's Day, let's put an end to these guys. And what do you know? Right when they approach Luffy and Zoro, they're dealt with in a manner of seconds. They both get one shot, they get knocked out, and again, naturally, this is where most fights would end. But no, no, no. Mr. 5 would not take that disrespect.
Wir von der Barockfirma finden es nämlich gar nicht komisch, wenn man sich über uns lustig macht.
Ihr nur! Ihr geht uns echt auf den Senkel! Ihr Nervensägen!
So now, coming in at number 10, this one is actually a little bit more honorable, but we have Luffy versus Blueno. So Blueno, out of everyone on this list, is the one character who actually put up somewhat of a decent fight. For the first half of the fight, you would actually think that Blueno has the upper hand because his door fruit powers were just that strange. Whenever Luffy would go in to hit Blueno, Blueno would simply teleport away, and then he would eventually just create doors inside of Luffy. Luffy wouldn't know how to stop them, and overall, it just did not look good for Luffy. But Luffy was holding back significantly because in the later half of the fight, Luffy activates Gear Second for the very first time. And that is when the tables started to turn on Blueno. Because at that point, Blueno could not keep up with Luffy's speed anymore. He couldn't tank any of Luffy's blows, even with his iron body. And to add to the beatdown and disrespect, Blueno didn't even survive long enough to witness Luffy's Gear Third. Because at the very end of the fight, you know, Luffy's like, whoa, this guy's, he's pretty durable.
Rifle!
All in all, I really do enjoy Blueno, because just like PX5, he was a great litmus test for Luffy's strength at the time, and not to mention, but his door fruit abilities are pretty dang busted. We saw firsthand what it was capable of in Enies Lobby, and even in Film Red, we saw how useful it was when Blueno took us to the door dimension. Another cool thing about Blueno is that Oda actually mentioned that he never thought Blueno would make Cypher Pole Zero, but he did end up making Blueno Cypher Pole Zero, because the Film Red producer and directors actually convinced him to do it. So yeah, if you ever wonder why CP9 managed to upgrade to CP0, you have the Film Red directors to thank for that one. So now on to the final beatdown on this list, we have Luffy versus Hannibal. And I would argue that this is my favorite beatdown on this list, simply because of the fact that Hannibal knew that he would lose this fight against Luffy, but despite that, he kept on getting back up time and time again. Every other opponent on this list thought that they could actually beat Luffy, right? Alvida was like, oh, this guy's a loser. You know, Vanderdecken didn't even care about Luffy for the most part. We had Moji, who saw this guy as a loser in a cage. Tomorrow Black was like, oh, it's just an old man crossing the street. I'm Straw Hat Luffy. Like, all of these guys thought that they were the hot shit. But not Hannibal. Hannibal knew that he could not win this battle. But despite that, he wanted to show pirates around the world that they cannot be allowed to roam free. And what makes the scene even better is that leading up to this point, Hannibal was a straight up coward. He was always shirking his responsibilities. He didn't care about Warden Magellan. So when he actually stood his ground here against Luffy, who was in gear second, Luffy was in gear second. Like, these punches kind of hurt. But Hannibal was like, yo, like, I won't let Straw Hat Luffy get out. I won't let a single prisoner escape this prison. I was like, dang, dude, this guy's standing on business. And then he backed it up and he was like, yo, if you guys escape, a lot of innocent people are gonna suffer. Like, impelled down means something. And I was like, dang, he's kind of spitting facts, right? Like, you know, Luffy and the group, you know, they're fine. Luffy's not gonna go around and terrorize a village. But the level 6 impelled down prisoners? You know, Crocodile, Buggy? I don't know, man. Like, Hannibal wasn't wrong, you know, there are just straight up a lot of bad pirates out there. Yes, there are some really good ones like, you know, Shanks and Whitebeard and Luffy and Rayleigh, but outside of them, dude, like, we got Doflamingo, we have Kaido, we got Big Mom, you know, like, we got a lot of bad apples out there. So in my opinion, Hannibal brought up a lot of really good points, and it really just shows how not black and white the entire world of One Piece really is. And that's actually backed up by what Blackbeard says, because Blackbeard comes in and finishes this fight. And he says, hey, chaos. And then that's pretty much it. yeah, rest in peace, Hannibal. He actually stood on business, unlike the rest of these bozos. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this list of beatdowns. We got 11 of them here. I'm sure there's plenty more in the series, but I did want to just focus on these 11 and mainly on Luffy fights. I'll probably be doing more of these lists later on. Let me know what you guys think about this list down below. And also, were there any important ones that I left off? The only important one that I think I left off would be Luffy versus the Celestial Dragon St. Charlos, but I wouldn't really consider that a fight, right? Like, Luffy, Tomorrow Black, Tomorrow Black, kind of a menace, right? He had a lot of people behind him. He had the fake Straw Hat crew. He had a bounty even, whereas St. Charlos, he's really just St. Charlos. But yeah, I'll catch you guys later. Signing out.